There we go. So Mike, I'm going to hand this over to you. And I think, can everybody hear us too? I think I'm seeing good chats and I haven't heard anybody saying there's an audio problem. So loud and clear, perfect. All right, so Mike, welcome and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And thanks for the invitation. Yeah, as you pointed out, I'm not really a wind or renewable energy person. I just do bat bioacoustics. I got involved in this project simply because we were interested in the broader question of how bats respond to noise. And the renewable energy offers a kind of a unique circumstance where that question actually has practical implications. So this project arose as a collaboration with some colleagues at the University of Massachusetts. Some of them involved in the wind energy program there, and then some engineers. And this presentation that I'm going to give today is just a slightly beefed up version of the presentation I gave to the Acoustical Society meeting earlier this spring. All right, so here we go. So, right, about 4 years ago now, Zara Dowling, who was a graduate student in Massachusetts, came out to visit our lab and play with the bats. And we talked about different ways that wind turbines could use sound to deter bats from crashing into windows. And we just started, well, this is the first time I really got into this idea. And so she introduced me to this problem that's illustrated pretty well by this slide here. That lots of bats are not only migratory, but they spend a lot of time flying long distances. And when they're faced with a situation like this, you can imagine how hard it is for them to slip through this gauntlet without getting crushed. And as I'm sure you all know, this has turned into a pretty big ecological problem around the planet, where you have so many wind turbines operating in places that also happen to be important migratory routes or transit routes for bats. So my understanding is that hundreds of thousands of bats are being killed every year by individual turbines. And when you do all the math, it turns out to be quite a large number of bats are impacted by this problem. In 2015, the Department of Energy invited proposals to test ideas on how to mitigate this problem. And that's what they invited me to help them with. So this is not a new question. People have been struggling with this for a while. And there's a lot of problems associated with trying to put an acoustic device on a wind turbine. The most obvious problem is that these wind turbines are intentionally being placed in rather harsh environmental conditions. Not only obviously places that have wind, but they have pretty extreme temperatures and rainfall. And so electronics don't naturally do very well in these conditions. And then you also have the problem of the moving blades. How do you insonify such a large device that's moving? So one of the approaches that's been explored is placing speakers, loudspeakers, on the nacelle, which is the center of the turbine, and then trying to project loud, annoying noises that will scare off the bats. And that's illustrated in this slide on the right. On the left is a nice thermal imaging picture of a bat flying past a wind turbine that gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. So because these are high frequencies, ultrasonic frequencies, that the distance that the sounds travel isn't very far. Compared to the speed of the bats and the speed of the wind turbines, it's difficult to generate sounds that project far enough and wide enough to really deter the bats from crashing into the wind turbines. But this is nonetheless the most straightforward approach, trying to place these loudspeakers at the nacelle. And a couple of different designs have emerged designs that have basically like 64 or 96 tiny ultrasonic speakers all broadcasting very loudly to try and impact the bats soon enough to deter them. But it's not a great solution. And you still have the problem of the electronics that aren't going to last very long in these harsh climates. So what we proposed to do in our project was to develop a passive ultrasonic whistle that could be attached at different positions all along the length of the turbine blade. And this wouldn't require electricity, and it would just generate sounds whenever the blades were moving in the air. And generating a whistle is not a really big deal, but we would need to build a whistle that managed to hit the correct target frequency range. For that, we looked at what kinds of bats were most strongly impacted by the wind turbines. This includes especially the hoary bats, pipistrelles, but most of the northern temperate bats are affected by these things. And so this gives us frequency range of 20 to 60 kilohertz. In order to make sure you're producing sounds that a lot of different species of bats can hear. And then of course the lower frequencies are better because they can project farther. But if you have a species like a pipistrelle that's operating in the 50 to 60 kilohertz range, it's not clear that they would actually be bothered by a 20 kilohertz signal. And then the amplitude is the really big problem. It's a big problem for electronics. It's also a big problem for just generating a passive whistle. So that was probably the biggest challenge for us, was finding out whether or not we could build a passive device that would be loud enough to ensure that the bats would hear it from a sufficient distance that they could avoid the wind turbine. All right. So the inspiration of this actually comes from biology. There's actually several animals that can generate very, very loud ultrasonic pulses without much power. The bats naturally do it. They can generate incredibly loud sounds at 120 to 140 decibels, and they're pretty small. So it's possible. And even this frog, this is a sort of an ultrasonic frog. This is a frog that generates ultrasonic sounds in order to communicate in noisy environments around waterfalls and streams. And so the frog doesn't have any really fancy anatomy or sophisticated architecture. It illustrates that with relatively low energy and a simple device, you can generate a pretty loud, high frequency sound. So this is what we thought we would do. Another example of this that we hope to build upon was, it was known that you can remove the larynx from a dead bat, and if you just push sound through it, it will generate ultrasonic frequencies. And then you can, just by adjusting the air pressure, you can generate different sounds. So you don't need all the neural mechanisms or the muscles to generate these sounds. A very, very small, and the bat larynx is only a couple of millimeters wide. A very small device can produce a very loud ultrasonic frequencies. And so basically the idea was, if we looked at these other animals and looked at how they were producing these ultrasonic frequencies at loud amplitudes, we could probably engineer something that could be equipped to the turbine blades. And it doesn't have to look or function exactly like the biological system, but the biological system provided enough evidence that it was possible. So this is the work that the engineers at Massachusetts did. And I wasn't really too involved with this, but the project is pretty straightforward. They had an idea of what the sizes that would be acceptable were that could be put on a turbine blade and not really interfere with its functions. We had an idea of where and how we would have to implement the device. And so a lot of this was just sort of routine trial and error to see what the best physical parameters of the model would be to produce the right sounds at the right amplitudes. There's a few other questions to explore as well, but this is basically the design we were focusing on. And this at the bottom here, this is really just a funnel. So starting with the funnel, exploring how big it would have to be and how long and how steep this gradient would be to accelerate the air and generate the pressures that you would need to produce high frequencies. So this was the graduate student, Dan Carlson at UMass. He worked on this project, mostly testing a lot of different sizes and shapes. In this illustration, he was examining what the impact of putting a protective screen on the front would be. And mostly the conclusion was that it was possible with the velocities of a typical turbine blade and air pressures, it would be possible to generate the pressures and the flows that we would need to generate ultrasound. So once they started building the whistle, they needed to get an idea of how it would actually function when it was just spinning in air. And the overall project had the goal of testing it first in the lab and then moving it outside to a small wind turbine and then eventually to test it on a large turbine. And so Dan began by testing it on a small motorized turbine here. And this is pretty small. The blades are only about 30 centimeters long. There we go. And we would attach the whistle that he developed here and then turn on the motor and then accelerate it until the tip of the turbine blade would reach approximately the speeds that were predicted to be relevant to an actual turbine. And then Dan had to work out another, several kind of just routine problems that made the project harder than you'd think. One is, in order to get this up to speed, he had to use rotations of about 150 rotations per minute, which is pretty fast spinning little fan blade on a desktop. And when you position the microphones, and over here on the right, here's a microphone here in position 1. This is intended to be pointed towards the face of the fan. And then microphone number 2 is set off to the side and it's pointed towards the edge of the fan blade. He wanted to see where the best way to record from it was. Because this thing was generating ultrasound, and ultrasound is highly directional, the microphone out here doesn't pick up anything. You have to have the microphone on the side, and then even then, it only picks up the noise when the whistle is pretty much pointed directly at the microphone. So, as the whistle's spinning around, the microphone is only catching it during that short period of time when the whistle's pointed at the microphone. So here's a recording that Dan made of the whistle that they built in the lab. And so it looks like here, okay, can you guys see my mouse? Is that evident to everybody else?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. I didn't want to be just pointing to myself. Right, so as the fan blades are spinning, the turbine's spinning, every few 100 milliseconds, the whistle would be pointed towards the microphone, and that's what you'd capture there. And it doesn't mean that the microphone is, or the whistle is producing sounds all the time, but it's only getting captured by the microphone periodically. So it kind of looks like there's a little pulse being generated, but actually this is a continuous broadband noise signal. Down here at the bottom, these are the motor sounds and the room sounds. So these wouldn't normally be showing up in the field. So what we were looking for is something that could work in this area. We were hoping to get it a little bit higher, but with the design that Dan came up with, it produced pretty loud sounds on the order of 60 to 70 decibels in this range, the critical range that we cared about, in this case, about 30 to 50 kilohertz. It's not ideal, still needs to be fine-tuned, but if as proof of principle, it was possible to create a whistle that would make a sound that could be loud enough for the bats to hear. And so Dan, tinkered around with a lot of the settings. One of the things I haven't showed you, because I don't actually have the diagram myself, is that as the air flows through this whistle, in the back end, there's a couple of films that have to vibrate. And probably the most complicated part of building this device is finding the right material to build the membranes out of, and then finding the right orientation to place them. So he played with different materials and different orientations and thicknesses. And this was just one example of the many things that he tested. Some of them produce low frequencies. By tinkering with it, you can make high frequencies, but then you also have other mechanical problems that he ran into. So ultimately, Dan was able to create a whistle that did the bare minimum of what we were looking for. And that part of the project still has a lot of room to grow. But it takes a lot more time than the Department of Energy likes. All right, let's see. Okay, so my role here was, once the engineers had built something that could potentially work, our job was to test to see if the bats actually cared about it. And that's actually a pretty challenging problem. So my lab has animal rooms where the bats live. We have a captive colony of bats, and we have a flight tunnel that we can do flight experiments with. And so the first step was to mimic the sounds that the whistle could produce, and then design some experiments to just try to demonstrate whether or not the bats cared about this sound at all. I mean, we were pretty certain that the bats could hear it, but hearing it and caring about it are two different things. And then ultimately, we were also going to do field experiments to see if we could demonstrate that the bats responded to this sound in a way that would indicate that it would work in the field. So going into this, we just had some guesses about what might and might not work. And we tried a couple different patterns. And here in Texas and around Texas A&M, we have one main kind of bat, the Mexican free-tail bat, which may not be the best bat for this study, but it's what we had. And as I'll show you, we also captured some pipistrelles and brought them in and ran some experiments with pipistrelles as well. So I'm going to show you some results from 3 different lab experiments with flying bats, and then I'll show you the results of the field experiments. So the first thing we tried to do was we took a tunnel, and then we put a wall, a thin wall in between it, so that the bats could fly down one side or the other of this tunnel. And the bats were trained to fly from one end to the other in order to receive a reward. And they had the choice of which side of this tunnel they could fly down. On either side of the tunnel wall, we had a speaker set, a pair of speakers on both sides, and we could randomly switch whether or not the sound was played on one side or the other. So a pretty straightforward experiment. We were not using the whistles, but what we did was Dan recorded the whistles, we mimicked that sound, and then we played an electronic version of that sound to the bats. And we played the sound very loud. We played 85 decibel sounds, which was louder than what the whistle produced, but we needed to know whether or not this would potentially work. And what you see here on the right, is the results. We had 6 bats that were trained to do this, and we would do 20 flights per bat per condition. The stimulus rate here is how many times per second we turned on the stimulus. So we didn't play a continuous broadband noise, but rather we had the noise turning on and off to try to mimic the situation of a bat approaching a wind turbine and then suddenly hearing a sound out of nowhere. And we played it at a moderate rate, and we played it at a fast rate. And we also tested just plain white noise to see if the bats would avoid white noise. And the proportion tells you what % of the time the bats chose the opposite side, or the quiet side compared to the loud side. And it was completely random. No matter how we ran this experiment, the bats were happy to fly down either side of the tunnel and really didn't seem to be impacted at all by the noise. So they heard the noise. They probably didn't like the noise, but the main challenge was that the bats didn't see it as a threat, so they had no concerns about flying through it. And that's actually a real concern for what would happen in a turbine situation. The bats could very well hear these sounds, but not consider them threatening, and that would make the whole endeavor rather pointless. And then experimentally in the lab, there's not really anything I can do to make the bats fear these sounds, so that's not going to help anything. And then one other thing that we noticed, which is kind of annoying, is that these bats have personalities, and they have their own trends. So, for example, there are bats that always like to fly on the right side. There are some bats that always like to fly on the left side. And the presence or absence of sounds won't change that. They have a lot of things going on in their head, and the presence of noise just isn't one of the most important things that they're worried about. So the Y maze was generally ineffective at determining whether or not the bats could be deterred by the sound. Another simpler experiment is we take a larger room that has smooth walls and a smooth ceiling, and there's no place for the bat to land because they can't grab onto the smooth walls. So on opposite sides of the room, we put up 2 perches, which are just large screens that are very easy for the bat to land on. And then above the perches, we can place a couple of ultrasonic microphones that are playing the noises. And then we can just randomly switch which perch has a noise and which perch doesn't. And then the way you do this experiment is you just release the bat into the room. You turn the speakers on one of the perches, and you let the bat fly around, and you see which one it lands on eventually. And in this case, it's pretty obvious that given the choice, the bats didn't land on the perches that had the noises. They avoid the noises, and they prefer to land on the quiet perches. So this is a really simple assay. You can even do this with 10 bats at a time, and you get the same result. So it shows that bats, when nothing else matters, they will avoid a sound. It demonstrates that they can hear the sounds, that they're annoyed by it, and they'll choose another path if they can. But still, this is not the best example of what we're looking for in terms of a wind turbine deterrent. So the last thing really came about from observing the bats. So I had a postdoc named Amanda Adams that was working with the bats. And in her experiments, she noticed that the bats did like to, well, as they flew back and forth, if you surprised the bats with noises, they would fly away from them. If you left it on and it was just running, they would adapt to it and ignore it. But if it turned on at just the right time, you could get them to fly away. So she developed what we called a turning assay. So as the bats fly back and forth down a flight tunnel, they get to one end and they obviously have to turn around and come back. Now, in this experiment, and I'm going to play the video in a minute, this is our flight tunnel. Down here, you'll see a small landing perch. And these bats are trained to fly down there, and if they land on the perch, they get a reward. On the sides, we have two speakers here and here that can play the annoying sound. And down here on the floor is a microphone that picks up the bat's own pulses. And what we did was we set the microphone to be the trigger to induce playback. And then we adjusted the threshold so that as the bat is flying down the tunnel, right as it approaches the middle of the tunnel, that triggers one or the other speaker to play a sound to it. And what Amanda was able to show was that when the bats hear a sound, they turn away from whatever side the sound came from. And this is a lot closer to what we were looking for in terms of demonstrating whether or not the sound could serve as a deterrent. The last thing I'll tell you before I play the video is that for the video purposes, we put a small infrared LED on the speakers. And the LED flashes every time the speaker plays a sound. So in the video, you can't hear the sounds being played, but anytime you see the flashing light, that's when the speaker is playing the sound. This room is normally in total darkness, and up above here on the top are rows of infrared LED strips. All right, so let me see if I can play this. Okay, I think that's the end. So these are our free-tail bats, the Mexican free-tail bats. These are pretty fast flying bats, and they're pretty reflexive in their behaviors. And Amanda found that this was pretty reliable, that in this trial, they almost always turned away from the speaker generating the noise. And if you turned off the speaker, then it was sort of random which direction they would turn in at the end of the flight. Oops. Right. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Shoot. Oh man, I'm missing a slide. Crap. Okay. Here, hold on one second. There's a slide missing. I have to go find it. All right, can everybody see that? It should say the turning away pipistrels.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. I got my presentations mixed up. So when we ran the experiment with the free-tail bats, that worked pretty good. But we went out and we collected the pipistrelles, or the tricolored bat, which is a smaller bat. It's a more solitary forest bat. And we experimented with those in the lab. And they fly a lot slower than the free-tail bats. The pipistrelles can hover. And especially, this is really important inside your lab, because for the free-tail bats, it's pretty challenging to navigate in these confined spaces. But for the pipistrelles, it's really easy for them to fly around and change directions. So we wanted to see what would happen for them in the same situation. And what we found was that, and I'll start this video, the pipistrelle bats had a completely different response. Well, that they really didn't care about the sound at all. But the difference is that the pipistrelle bats can fly pretty slowly, they're more maneuverable, and they don't seem to be, well, as threatened by the noise. Part of it may be that the noise isn't moving, that the speakers are in a fixed position and the bats know it's in a fixed position. So they don't really see it as a threat. But maneuverability seems to clearly have an impact on the way the bats respond to artificial noises. And that's another concern for this project, that if you're wondering, why would an acoustic stimulus on a turbine affect some bats and not others? Well, maneuverability could be an important factor. Now, first of all, the obvious thing might be that slower moving bats are more likely to be impacted by a wind turbine. But conversely, faster moving bats may respond more reflexively to these noises than the slow moving bats. Okay, so now the field tests. So you can see that we did, I think, as much as we could do in the lab, and we were never going to get really clear evidence of whether or not this acoustic stimulus would do a good job of deterring bats from following a path. And really what we're looking for is a change in the locomotor trajectory. So we began using just acoustics. So you can go out anywhere around here and point a microphone at the sky at night, and there's lots of bats flying around all night long. And we did that, and let me see. Okay. And the idea was we would go out and we would go on top of a building, and we would just record bats flying over, and we would set a threshold for how loud the pulses would have to be, which told us roughly how close the bats were to our recording apparatus. And then we had a set of speakers on a pole pointed upwards. And then we would just record the bats flying overhead. And periodically we would turn the acoustic stimulus on for 10 minutes and then turn it off for 10 minutes and turn it on and turn it off and turn it on and turn it off. And then go back and count the number of bat passes that came pretty close to our microphone. And we did that, and we calculated the number of bats per hour over 10 nights, and we saw no effect at all. This isn't terribly surprising, but we were hoping for an easy answer, and we didn't get one. So the stimulus was pretty loud. These were 4 speakers, about 1 meter apart, all pointing in the same direction, playing an 85 decibel sound. It was quite annoying. And even though it was ultrasound, we could hear it as well. It's a pretty annoying sound. But it had no impact at all on the number of bats flying over our microphone. But of course, there's a lot of limitations to that. We couldn't actually see what the bats were doing. It was possible that the bats were changing their direction, and we just couldn't detect it using the microphones. It was possible that the bats were going in the wrong direction and that they were oriented in such a way that they wouldn't have heard our stimulus. So there were a lot of confounding factors that made this less than ideal. But on the other hand, we didn't have really any other tools to do this. So we were doing the best we could with what we had available. And I provided these results to the DOE. And of course, they weren't happy with them either. But fortunately, they were able to send us a couple of thermal imaging video cameras, courtesy of Bat Conservation International, that would allow us to redo the experiment, but with the cameras be able to see what the bats were actually doing overhead. Or at least that was the idea. Okay. So now I'm going to show you a video of the situation that we were faced with once we had the thermal imaging cameras. So this is on the top of the building, overlooking a park with oak trees. And from the ground or from the building, we could hear lots and lots of bats overhead. And we were hoping that they would be flying and foraging over the trees and that we'd be able to complete the experiments in this way. The camera is hooked up to a bat detector that is transforming the sounds. So the sounds are ultrasonic. The bat detector lowers the frequency so that we can hear them. So ideally in the video, you should be able to hear the bats. So what you're probably noticing now is that there are no bats in the video frame. And this is what we ended up spending an entire summer looking at. It was one of the most annoying and frustrating things I've ever had to deal with. Because on the microphones, we could pick up lots and lots of bat activity, but with the camera, it was clear that there were no bats within our field of view. That's not to say that we couldn't find the bats. It's just that the microphone recordings were a bit misleading. So as we went around, we tried taller and taller buildings. And what we were faced with was a situation where it turned out that the bats were there. They were just very, very high, much higher than we anticipated, which was really surprising considering how loud the pulses were at the point of our microphone. So in this video, you'll see two bats flying overhead. You'll see them up here near the top. There's no sound in this video. Okay, there's the first bat, and he's being followed by a second bat. So once we could see what the bats were doing, we began to appreciate why our stimulus wasn't working. Was that the stimulus, we knew what the projection range was. It was probably going to be effective theoretically within a range of 10 to 20 meters, maybe more if we got lucky. But these bats were hundreds of meters over our head. And we really had no chance of interacting with them from the ground or from the top of a building. I have a couple more videos to show you. We did get lots of cool videos of bats, just they were never close enough for us to interact with. All right, and if you point the camera straight up, these were really great cameras. I was really happy with the cameras. They gave us fantastic resolution from very far away, but they had this auto calibrate function. So they would analyze everything in the scene and figure out where the coolest spot and the warmest spot is, and then auto calibrate the pixel colors. And if you point the camera straight up, then it doesn't work. This is kind of an example of what happens. basically the entire sky is the same temperature, and the camera really struggles to set its auto calibration. So you get these kind of crazy color schemes, but you can still catch the bats. But this is with the camera pointing straight up at the sky. There's actually 3 or 4 bats in this video. There's another one up here, and one over there, one over there. So this is the answer to our riddle. There were plenty of bats overhead. They were just very, very high. And as it turned out, we had no chance of affecting them with our acoustic stimulus, not in this way. So unfortunately, that's where the project ended, that we were unable to find a scenario where we could effectively test the stimulus. And at this point, it looks like the only way to really do it would be to put these things on a wind turbine and just see what happens. As I'm totally at a loss. If anybody else has an idea for how to do this way up there in the sky, I'd be happy to hear it. Okay. The last thing we tried was we went to an abandoned warehouse that was, well, is a home to a large group of bats. And we tried experiments by putting the speakers outside the windows where the bats come in and out. And this creates its own set of problems. So here, we can get the speakers all the way around the windows where the bats come in and out. And there's plenty of bats. But then, ironically, the problem is the bats are too loud. And this is a totally different problem. Our speakers are, again, pretty loud, and we use a filter bank, or not a filter bank, a speaker array. So we can totally insonify the windows or one side of the windows, but we can't compete with the bats. And if there's 100 bats in that room, and in that case there was more than 100 bats flying around in there, I can start it again. The bats are always louder than our speakers. And they're more concerned with the other flying bats than they are the speakers that we're able to generate. So the answer wasn't to go find a place that reliably had more bats in a smaller area. That experiment really didn't work either. We got a lot of cool videos from that, but it wasn't very effective. So that is where the project is now. So we were able to demonstrate that it is possible to build a fairly small device that's very light, that could practically be put on a wind turbine blade. In fact, you could put several of these spread out along a wind turbine blade, and it would generate sounds that could potentially be detected by bats 10 to 20 meters away, which hopefully would be enough time for them to avoid a collision. The whistle can function and produce these sounds at realistic speeds and conditions that would be typical for the turbines. In the lab, we could demonstrate that the bats reflexively turn away from the sounds of the whistle when it appears suddenly. But when the sound is always there, they acclimate to it and they stop paying attention to it. And we also saw species-specific differences in the response, which is an important factor to take into account as these studies evolve. But most importantly, we completely failed to get a successful test of this outside in the field. And the main problem was that the solitary bats were too rarely flying close enough to our recording equipment to actually conduct an experiment. And then if you go to a place where there's lots of bats reliably, then the bats themselves are too loud, and our stimulus becomes drowned out in the cacophony of bat pulses. So that's where the project stands right now. We're not done with it, but right now, until we come up with some really cool ideas and better equipment, I'm not sure where we're going to go with this. And that is my presentation. Up a little short.
All right, we've got 11 people in our room, and I'm sure there will be questions or thoughts about how you could get that high up into the sky for the bats. But I want to share personally, thank you for sharing this, because I understand how frustrating it can be when projects don't work out. And there's a lot of students sitting around in our room right now, and working with biology is hard, and it doesn't work out probably more than 50% of the time as we'd like. And so it's kind of fun to brainstorm. I was wondering, have you thought about drones?
Yeah, I mean, that would be really cool. The problem will always be that, you know, wherever you put the drone, that's just a pretty small space in a pretty big sky. And so unless you know that you're right on a route where lots of bats are going to fly over, it's still going to take you a very, very long time to collect the data that you need to confirm it. And being someone that's played around with drones, I'm lucky if I can keep it from not crashing for 30 minutes. I certainly can't keep it in the same place for 30 minutes.
I think you'd actually have more luck with the balloon.
One of the people in our room just said, how about a balloon?
Yeah, that's possible. I think the biggest need is that you need probably a really long time.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm aware that some of these trials have been done. You can do it in a place like around a small pond in the forest, or maybe if you have a pathway in the forest that bats use as a transit route, you could probably do it there. But you would just have to be really patient. Probably patience is the most important thing. I imagine if you could go somewhere and just spend 3 months recording every night, you could probably do this.
We have a comment here. It says, yes to that. Thank you for being willing to share a project that wasn't a success as a model for students. That's from John Buck at UMass Dartmouth. And if other people have questions, please feel free to write them in, and I can shout them out to everybody. I heard next comment, good talk. So it sounds as if the bats are adapted to noise like frogs and some insects. Do you think if you produced a multimodal noise stimulus, perhaps coupling ultrasound with a visual stimulus, that this might be more effective?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, a lot of people think that bats are blind. They may not have good vision, but they're not blind. So it's possible that if you had a flashing light in conjunction with it, that might have an effect. It's hard to predict.
Someone wrote in about smell too as maybe another modal. Pheromones. Bats have good noses.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Smell. Well, just not much is known about olfactory capabilities in bats or how they respond to it. In the case of the free-tailed bats, you know, they are very smelly species, and I'm sure that they use olfactory communication for finding roosts. But I have a hard time imagining finding a smell that they would naturally avoid.
The wind blowing towards us.
Right? And you have to keep in mind that you can't train these bats to fear a smell or avoid a smell.
That's true.
You have to find something that they just instinctively didn't like. Even then, it's pretty slow. That's a very slow stimulus modality.
Here's another question. If the bats react better to the sound when it pulses like echolocation of an oncoming bat, do you have any ideas for how to pulse the whistle sound on the turbine?
Yes, and actually that was in the original design. And I think if we had more time and more money, we would consider developing this whistle further to have to create clicks. Broadband clicks would be better than a continuous whistle sound. And I say that because it makes sense that the bats, we may not be able to scare away the bats, but that may not be the goal. The goal might be just to make it easy for them to localize the moving blades so that they can avoid them easier. The bats are going to have a much easier time localizing discrete pulses rather than a continuous sound. And so if we could add some kind of basically a gating mechanism, a glottis, if you will, that opened and closed once the pressure reached a certain level, we could generate clicks, broadband clicks, that the bats could probably do a better job localizing.
Jim Simmons wrote in that they have lots of projects to share in that vein. I think in not desirable results, I think is what he meant. And he also had a question here. Perhaps the echo reflectivity of the blades is a problem. The blades are carefully sculpted to have an airflow friendly curve. It might be that the arrival direction of the echoes is not the direction to the sound source, meaning the bat.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe there are people that are working on like texture coatings for the turbine blades in order to explore that possibility.
I have a question. There's been studies that I'm aware of with birds, and do the results of the birds in any way help in your design or overall hope for success in this project?
To be fair, I haven't really studied the bird experiments very much, so I can't say too much about it. I don't want to forget that the birds are also being killed by the wind turbines. And it's kind of the same problem, I guess, except that in the visual domain. So I don't know.
I think we have one more question. Why can't the whistle be placed on the center of the turbine? Would that not have them fly far enough away from the blades to avoid collision?
Well, the whistle works by passively forcing air through it, which requires the movement of the blades. So if you have the whistle out at the tip of the blades, that's where the airflow is going to be highest. I assume that if you have it in the center at the nacelle, then it's not going to have enough airflow to function.
Okay, we are just about hitting our time. This was good discussion afterwards, and I really appreciate your time in joining us and presenting this information. I found it fascinating. We've got lots of claps coming in virtually here for you, and from our 11 here at UNH, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I'm sure Dan will follow up with you too.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. We appreciated it. This was great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Gonna stop recording.